The boy's voice cracked when he asked the question, and that crack, that fragile, desperate fracture in a 12-year-old's composure, was what finally broke Cyrus Whitaker open after 3 years of keeping himself sealed tight as a drum. "Is she ever coming back?" the boy asked. "My mama, is she ever coming back to us?" Cyrus looked at young Thomas Rhodes, standing there in the dust outside the Redemption Creek General Store with his hat clutched in both hands, knuckles white as bleached bone, eyes red from crying but refusing to let a single tear fall. He was his mother's son in every way that mattered. Same stubborn jaw. Same fire behind the eyes that refused to admit defeat even when defeat was sitting right on top of you. Cyrus had been asked 1,000 questions in his 34 years on this earth. Questions from sheriffs. Questions from outlaws with guns pressed to his temples. Questions from judges and preachers and women who wanted something from him he had never quite figured out how to give. But this question from this boy on this dust-choked afternoon in the summer of 1882 was the one that cracked his chest clean open. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Thomas. His knees popped. He didn't care. "Your mama," Cyrus said, his voice rough as gravel but steady as bedrock, "is the kind of woman a man does not ride away from twice." Thomas stared at him. "Then why did my papa ride away from her twice?" Cyrus felt the weight of that question land somewhere deep and permanent in his chest. He had no good answer for why Edward Rhodes had done what he did. He had no good answer for why any man who had ever been loved by Anna Rhodes had managed to squander it. He only knew what he knew about himself, and what he knew about himself was this. The first time he had ridden away from Anna Rhodes, he had spent every single day of the 4 years that followed wishing he hadn't. He was not going to make that mistake again. "That," Cyrus said carefully, "is something your papa is going to have to answer for himself. But I'll tell you what I know, Thomas. Your mama is going to come back because she does not abandon the people she loves. And when she does, I am going to be standing right here. You hear me?" Thomas looked at him for a long moment with those old, wise eyes that children in hard circumstances develop like a second skin. "You love her," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question. I have loved your mama," Cyrus admitted, "since before you were born. That was the truth." The rest of the truth was longer and harder and wound back 7 years to a different town, a different version of both of them, and a choice Cyrus Whitaker had made that he had regretted every single day since. 7 years earlier, the town of Harlan's Bluff, Texas, was the kind of place that chewed people up and spat them out with a smile. It sat on the edge of nothing in particular, surrounded by scrubland that gave way to more scrubland. And the only thing that gave it any color at all was the saloon with its red painted door, and the flower boxes outside the seamstress shop that always had something blooming in them no matter how dry the season got. Those flower boxes belonged to Anna Rhodes, though she wasn't Rhodes yet then. She was Anna Calloway, 23 years old and freshly arrived from Missouri, and she had brought those flower box seeds all the way across the territory wrapped in a square of muslin tucked into the bottom of her trunk. She'd told Cyrus about those seeds on the second day they knew each other, sitting on the front porch of the boarding house where she'd taken a room, and he'd thought it was the most deliberate, hopeful thing he'd ever heard of. Carrying flower seeds across the frontier, on the chance that something might grow. Cyrus had been 27 then, working as a hired gun for the Harlan's Bluff Town Council, which was a polite way of saying he kept the peace in situations where the law had already tried and failed. He wasn't a lawman himself, had never wanted the badge and the politics that came with it, but he was good with a gun and better at reading people, and that combination kept him employed and alive in a time and place where both were difficult achievements. He'd met Anna on a Tuesday. He'd been in love with her by Thursday. He'd known it with a certainty that frightened him by the following Monday. She was not beautiful in the way that men in saloons talked about beautiful. She was something more specific than that, more particular. She was tall for a woman of that era, with dark hair that she wore pinned up in ways that never quite stayed put, and brown eyes that looked at everything with a kind of careful, considering attention that made you feel like whatever you said to her actually mattered. She laughed easily and honestly, without calculation, and she had a way of listening that made even the most unremarkable person feel like the most interesting person in the room. She had come to Harlan's Bluff to teach school. The town had advertised for a schoolteacher in a St. Louis paper, and Anna, who had been working as a governess for a wealthy family and finding the work both comfortable and suffocating, had answered the advertisement on an impulse she later described to Cyrus as the best decision I have ever made that terrified me completely. Cyrus had been assigned by the town council to meet the incoming stage and escort the new arrivals safely through town. The stage that September afternoon carried 3 passengers: a traveling medicine salesman named Croft who smelled of camphor and ambition, an elderly cattleman named Beaumont who was coming home to die in familiar country, and Anna Calloway, who stepped off the stage with a trunk that was too heavy for her to lift alone, a carpet bag that clearly had too many books in it, and an expression of such determined, undaunted calm that Cyrus had been struck momentarily dumb. "You're the welcoming committee," she said, looking at him directly, the way women in 1875 were generally not supposed to look at men they didn't know. "I am," he said. "Is the town always this quiet, or did I arrive on the wrong day?" "It's always this quiet until it isn't," he said. "The quiet is the part you enjoy while it lasts." She'd looked at him for a moment with those considering brown eyes, and then she'd smiled. "That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 6 months. Help me with this trunk." He had helped her with the trunk. He had helped her get settled in the boarding house. He had, over the following weeks and months, found 1,000 small reasons to be wherever Anna Calloway happened to be, and she had made it clear, in ways that were subtle and unmistakable at the same time, that she did not find his presence unwelcome. They had never managed to officially court in any formal sense, because Harlan's Bluff was a town that ran on gossip and judgment, and Anna was newly arrived and trying to establish herself as a figure of respectability and authority for the parents who were entrusting her with their children. But there had been conversations on the boarding house porch that stretched from sunset to full dark. There had been walks along the edge of town in the early mornings when the air was cool, and the world hadn't started its noise yet. There had been the afternoon when a sudden rainstorm had caught them both in the open, and they'd sheltered under the overhang of the livery stable, pressed close by necessity, and Anna had turned to look at him with rain in her eyelashes, and he had been so completely undone that he'd nearly said something he had no right to say yet. He'd said it with his eyes instead. She'd seen it. She'd let him see that she saw it. That was its own kind of promise. And then the job had gone wrong. The thing about being a hired gun for a town council in 1875 was that sometimes the job that started clean turned complicated fast. The council had been dealing with a land dispute that had been simmering for 2 years between the largest cattle operation in the county and a cluster of small farmers who held water rights that the cattle operation needed. The kind of dispute that started with lawyers and ended with blood if no one resolved it carefully. Cyrus had been brought in to resolve it carefully. What he hadn't known, what no one had told him, was that the town council itself had a financial stake in the outcome that they had never disclosed. He'd spent 6 weeks working what he thought was a neutral mediation, riding between the cattle operation and the small farms, gathering information, building a framework for a settlement. And then one of the small farmers, a man named Alvarez who had 3 children and a wife and had been on that land for 15 years, had come to Cyrus in secret and shown him documents proving that 2 council members had been paid to ensure the cattle operation won. Cyrus had spent 48 hours deciding what to do with that information. He'd made the wrong choice. He'd confronted the council directly, in private, which had given them time to prepare. They'd fabricated a counteraccusation against him, something about a theft he had allegedly committed during his time working another job in another county, and within a week, Cyrus had been run out of Harlan's Bluff on the threat of a false arrest. He hadn't said goodbye to Anna. That was the thing he had never forgiven himself for. He had left a note at the boarding house, brief and inadequate and cowardly, because he had told himself he was protecting her from the blowback of his situation, that the council's anger would extend to anyone associated with him, and she was too new in town to withstand that. He had told himself it was the right thing for her, and somewhere underneath that, he had known it was the easier thing for him, because saying goodbye to Anna Calloway face to face would have required him to admit that he was leaving, and admitting that he was leaving would have required him to reckon with how completely that was the wrong thing to do. He'd left. He'd ridden north into the territory. He'd spent the next year and a half trying to forget her, and the year after that acknowledging that forgetting her was not possible, and the year after that learning to live with that. Anna had married Edward Rhodes 14 months after Cyrus left. He'd heard about it from a traveling trader who'd come through a settlement in the New Mexico territory where Cyrus was working for a freight operation. That pretty schoolteacher in Harlan's Bluff married that lawyer fellow, Rhodes, the trader had said, in the casual way men pass information they don't know matters. They say she seems happy. Cyrus had said nothing. He'd gone back to work and he had not allowed himself to think about it for 6 days, and then on the 7th day he'd sat outside his bunk and thought about it until the thinking was done. He'd made his bed. He could lie in it. Anna Calloway deserved a man who stayed. Thomas Rhodes was born in 1876. Cyrus learned that from the same trader network that seemed to carry every piece of news that mattered to him. He'd felt something complicated and quiet about that information, something that took him a long time to identify as grief not for himself, but for the version of the future that had been possible before he'd made cowardly choices. Edward Rhodes turned out to be, in the assessment of everyone who knew him, a charming, educated, ultimately unreliable man who had loved Anna well during the good years and poorly during the difficult ones. He was a lawyer who handled land claims and had a talent for the social performance of respectability that concealed a fundamental unwillingness to be inconvenient for anyone, including his wife. He had left Anna the first time in 1879 when Thomas was 3, citing an opportunity in New Mexico that required him to relocate temporarily. The relocation had extended. The letters had grown infrequent. He had returned after 8 months with apologies and gifts for Thomas and new promises that Anna, because she was Anna and she believed in the possibility of people, had accepted. He had left the second time in 1881, and this time there was no ambiguity about the nature of his departure. He left with the money from the sale of a parcel of land that was jointly theirs, which had legally required her signature, and which she had signed in good faith believing it was for the investment he had described. He left with that money, and he left with a woman named Clara Fontaine, who was 20 years old, and had worked as a waitress in the hotel restaurant in Harlan's Bluff, and he left without a word of explanation to Anna or a goodbye to his son. Anna had been 29 years old and the mother of a 5-year-old boy when she became, in the parlance of 1881, a deserted wife. She had very little money. The house they'd lived in, which was rented, a teaching position she'd resumed when Thomas was old enough to be left with Mrs. Potts next door, and a stubbornness that had always been her truest and most permanent feature. She had stayed in Harlan's Bluff for 3 more months, and then the school board, under pressure from several council members who were uncomfortable with the presence of a deserted wife as a model for their children, had declined to renew her contract for the following year. The injustice of it was breathtaking and completely ordinary for 1881, a time when the full weight of marital failure was understood to land on women regardless of who had actually failed. Anna had done what she did with every impossible situation she faced. She had identified her options methodically and chosen the one that gave her the most control. Her mother's cousin was a woman named Harriet Boone, who had been operating the general store in a small but growing town called Redemption Creek in the Colorado Territory since the death of her husband 5 years earlier. Harriet had written to Anna when the news of Edward's desertion reached her, and the letter had been practical and warm in equal measure. If you need a fresh start, there is one here. The store needs a second pair of hands. The town needs a teacher. Come. Anna had gone. She had packed everything that mattered, including Thomas and the seeds she always seemed to find somewhere to keep growing, and she had loaded them onto the stage for Redemption Creek. Cyrus Whitaker had arrived in Redemption Creek 4 months earlier, which was the kind of coincidence that made a man either religious or philosophical depending on his temperament. He had come because a former associate named Bart Langley had written to tell him there was legitimate work available. A rancher named Hollister, who needed a reliable man to manage the movement of cattle and deal with the rustling problem that had been plaguing the eastern range. Cyrus had been in Oklahoma, doing similar work with diminishing satisfaction, and the letter from Langley had arrived at a moment when he was ready to try somewhere new. He had not known Anna was in Redemption Creek. Not until he walked into Harriet Boone's general store on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1881 to buy flour and coffee, and looked up from the counter to find Anna Rhodes staring at him from behind a glass display case full of patent medicines and ribbons. The silence lasted long enough to be its own event. "Cyrus Whitaker," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. Her eyes were something else. "Anna," he said. And then, because he had been carrying the inadequacy of the note he'd left for 7 years, "I owe you a better explanation than a letter." "You owe me several things," she said. "What will it be?" He bought the flour and the coffee. He came back the next day. And the day after that. She did not make it easy for him, which was correct of her. She had every reason in the world to find his arrival in Redemption Creek suspicious or unwanted, and she was a woman who had been left without explanation by 2 different men, Cyrus first, and then more catastrophically by Edward, and the defenses she had built around herself since then were not arbitrary. They were the product of real and specific damage, but she also did not send him away. And Cyrus understood that for what it was. He had gone to her on his 3rd visit to the store on an afternoon in October when the light was turning golden and the store was empty of other customers, and he had told her. He had told her all of it, the council corruption, the false accusation, the choice he'd made to leave without saying goodbye, and more importantly, why he had really made that choice. He told her about the cowardice underneath the pragmatism, about how he'd told himself he was protecting her, and had known even then that he was also protecting himself from the difficulty of the goodbye, from having to say out loud that he was leaving her. Anna had listened to all of it with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes on him and her face unreadable. When he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I know you weren't perfect, Cyrus. I am also not asking you to be. I am asking you to be honest, which you are finally being. Give me some time." He had given her time. It was the most difficult thing he had ever been asked to do in 34 years, but he had given her time because it was what she'd asked for and because she was worth it. They found their way back to each other slowly, which was the only honest way to do it. It started with Thomas. Thomas Rhodes, who was 5 years old when his mother arrived in Redemption Creek and 6 by the time the autumn settled properly, was a boy of precise and searching intelligence who had inherited his mother's habit of watching and considering before he acted. He was also, underneath the careful shell that months of upheaval had built, a child who needed steadiness, who needed the evidence that the world contained things that did not leave. Cyrus had never been particularly natural with children, but he was natural with Thomas in a way that surprised them both. He didn't talk down to the boy. He didn't perform affection he didn't feel. He answered Thomas's questions directly, including the ones that were inconvenient, and he let Thomas decide the pace of their acquaintance without pressure. Thomas, in turn, had decided somewhere around the fourth week that Cyrus Whitaker was acceptable, and had communicated this by asking Cyrus if he could ride his horse. Cyrus had spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon walking Thomas around the paddock on the back of a patient bay gelding named Cooper, and Anna had stood at the paddock fence watching the two of them with an expression that Cyrus had tried not to look at too directly, because it had done things to his chest that he wasn't quite ready to reckon with. Through the winter of 1881 and into 1882, Cyrus became a permanent feature of Anna and Thomas's lives in the careful, understated way that things become permanent in communities where everyone notices everything. He ate Sunday dinner at Harriet Boone's table with Anna and Thomas on most Sundays. He fixed the loose board on the porch of the house Anna had rented on the east side of town, because she mentioned it once in passing, and he was there with a hammer the next morning. He spent a Sunday afternoon helping Thomas learn to whittle, an activity that produced 3 extremely irregular wooden shapes that Thomas declared were a horse, a dog, and a mountain, respectively, and which Anna displayed on the windowsill of the kitchen with complete seriousness. What Cyrus did not do, for months, was declare himself. He was terrified of doing it wrong again. He was terrified of pushing too fast and breaking the careful scaffolding of trust that was going up, plank by plank, between them. He had left her once without adequate words, and he was determined that the next time he opened himself up to her, it was going to be the right time and the right words. And so he waited and worked and stayed present, and let the truth of his feelings accumulate in the ordinary space between them. Anna was not oblivious to any of this. Anna was one of the least oblivious people Cyrus had ever encountered. She was also dealing with things that were not simple. The formal situation of her marriage to Edward Rhodes was unresolved in the legal sense, which meant she was technically a deserted wife rather than a divorced woman, and the social weight of that distinction in 1882 was significant. She had written to a lawyer in Denver about the process of obtaining a formal divorce on the grounds of desertion, and the lawyer had written back with information that was both clear and expensive, and required locating Edward Rhodes to serve him with papers, which was complicated by the fact that no one knew precisely where Edward and Clara Fontaine had landed. The secrets of Edward's departure were also not entirely settled. In the spring of 1882, a man named Caldwell who worked for a freight company arrived in Redemption Creek and let it be known, in the way of men who enjoy the currency of information, that he had seen Edward Rhodes alive and apparently prosperous in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was, according to Caldwell, working as a legal clerk for a land brokerage and living in a house that was not modest. When this information reached Anna through Harriet, who had heard it from Caldwell at the general store, and felt that Anna needed to know, Anna had gone very quiet for the rest of that day. The following morning she'd appeared at the store as usual, efficient and calm and present, and only someone who knew her as well as Cyrus now knew her would have noticed the particular set of her jaw that meant she was angry and working very hard to contain it productively rather than destructively. Cyrus found her in the storage room behind the store that afternoon, taking inventory with a methodical intensity that he recognized as what she did with her hands when her mind was working hard. "I heard about Caldwell," he said. She said, "You have every right to be furious." "I am aware of my rights." She counted a row of tinned goods and made a mark in her ledger. "I am deciding what to do with the information practically, which is more useful than fury. Being furious is also practical sometimes," he said. "Helps you know what matters to you." She stopped counting and turned to look at him. "Cyrus, if I let myself be as furious as I actually feel about Edward Rhodes, I will not be able to keep the rest of myself in order. And the rest of myself, Thomas, this job, this life we are building here, matters more than my fury does." "It matters," he said. "You are allowed to let it matter." She looked at him for a long time. Then something in her face shifted and she said, "Will you come to dinner on Thursday? Thomas has been asking." "I'll be there," he said. He was there. He was also there on Friday because Thomas had developed a fascination with the mechanics of Cyrus's gun belt and had 100 questions about the construction of a single-action revolver that required visual demonstration. And Cyrus had sat at the kitchen table for an hour dismantling and reassembling the piece under Thomas's intense supervision, talking through every component. The gun had not been loaded during this process. Anna had sat across the table reading a borrowed copy of a novel and not looking at them with such practiced concentration that it was obvious she was listening to every word. It was late by the time Cyrus left. Thomas was in bed. Anna walked him to the door, which she usually did, and on this particular Thursday evening in April of 1882, instead of the brief, warm, insufficient goodbye that had been their pattern, Cyrus turned at the door and said what he should have said months ago. "Anna, I need to say something to you, and I need to say it directly, and then you can do whatever you want with it." She looked at him. Her hand was on the door frame. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since 1875. I made a decision then that was wrong, and I cannot undo it, and I am not asking you to pretend it didn't happen. I am asking you to know that I am not that man anymore in the ways that mattered then. I'm not going to leave without saying so. I'm not going to leave without asking. And if you tell me right now that you do not have feelings for me and you want me to step back and be simply a friend to you and Thomas, I will do that. I will be here either way. But I am not going to let more time go by without you knowing." The silence lasted long enough that he felt every second of it. Then Anna said, quietly and carefully, "Cyrus, I have been waiting for you to say that since November." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his immediately, like they'd been waiting for that too. "I am in the middle of complicated legal circumstances," she said. "The divorce is not resolved. Edward has not been served. There are things I cannot fully offer you until—" "I know," he said. "I am not asking for anything you cannot give right now. I am only asking you to know what I feel." "I know what you feel," she said, "and I think you know what I feel." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his jaw, and she let him, and they stood like that in the doorway for a long moment while the stars came out over the flat dark land around Redemption Creek. "The flowers are blooming," she said, nodding toward the window boxes she had installed on the front of the house, which were full of something yellow and relentless that had started coming up in March. "I brought seeds from Harlan's Bluff." "Of course you did," he said. She laughed softly. He felt it like a physical thing, that laugh, like sunlight on a cold morning. Things moved forward with the particular pace of two people who had each been through enough to know that patience was not weakness but wisdom. Cyrus did not rush her. Anna did not pretend that the practicalities weren't real. They moved through spring and into summer with the careful deliberateness of people who were building something they intended to last. And then, in July of 1882, the complicated legal circumstances arrived in person. Edward Rhodes rode into Redemption Creek on a gray horse on a Thursday morning, which was the day Anna worked the late shift at the general store so Harriet could rest her knees. He did not appear to be accompanied by Clara Fontaine. He appeared to be, and this was the hidden motive that explained everything about the timing of his arrival broke. Cyrus found out about Edward's arrival from Bart Langley, who had been at the livery stable when the man rode in and had recognized him from descriptions. Langley rode out to the Hollister ranch where Cyrus was working and delivered the news with the apologetic air of a man who understands he is delivering trouble. Cyrus rode back to town immediately. He was not technically anyone with authority over Anna's situation. He was a man who loved her and whom she had allowed to love her, and Edward Rhodes, whatever else he was still her legal husband until a court said otherwise. That was the law. That was also the specific trap that Edward's timing had set, whether consciously or by accident. Edward had gone to the general store because someone, Cyrus, never found out who had told him that was where Anna worked. He had walked in at mid-morning, and Anna had looked up from behind the counter and seen him, and according to Harriet, who had witnessed the whole thing from the back room, Anna had not said a single word for 15 full seconds. She had simply looked at him with an expression that Harriet described as like a woman deciding whether to step back or step forward. She had stepped forward. By the time Cyrus arrived, the conversation was happening on the porch of the store, which was a public space on a public street, which was either a smart choice on Anna's part or Edward's. Cyrus reined Cooper in across the street and sat watching because he understood that this was Anna's battle to fight, and she didn't need him riding to her rescue. She was the least rescuable woman he had ever known. What he could see of the conversation, without hearing it, was that Anna was doing most of the talking and Edward was doing most of the looking at the ground. That was its own kind of information. It lasted about 20 minutes. At the end of it, Edward looked up and said something, and Anna shook her head once clearly, and then she turned and went back inside the store. Edward stood on the porch for a moment looking at the closed door, and then he walked back toward the livery. Cyrus crossed the street, tied Cooper to the post, and went into the store. Anna was behind the counter, her hands flat on the wood, her breathing controlled but audible. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "He wanted money. He and Clara split up. He said he wanted to come back." She looked up at Cyrus with an expression that was clear and decided. "I told him no. I told him I wanted the divorce. I told him I had a lawyer working on it and I would be sending him to locate Edward through a court in Santa Fe." She paused. "He said he did not consent to the divorce." Cyrus kept his voice level. "He does not have to consent in Colorado territory after documented desertion exceeding 18 months. "I know that," she said. "My lawyer told me." She took a breath. "He was smaller than I remembered him, not physically, in every way that counts, standing there on that porch asking me for something after what he did to Thomas and to me, and he was just smaller." "What did he say about Thomas?" Cyrus asked. Something shifted in Anna's face. "He asked to see him. I told him Thomas was in school and that any arrangement regarding Thomas's time would go through the court proceedings." Her voice was precise and careful, the way it got when she was working very hard to stay above the anger. "He has not asked after Thomas in a year. He did not send a birthday letter. He did not send money for the boy's care. And he stands on my porch and asks to see him like it is a casual thing." Cyrus came around the counter. He stood close but didn't touch her, giving her the space to choose. She chose to lean into him. He put his arms around her, and she put her forehead against his chest, and neither of them said anything for a while. He could feel the tension in her shoulders and the slow, deliberate way she breathed it down. "He is not going to be a problem," Cyrus said quietly. "Not for you and not for Thomas, I will make sure of that." She lifted her head and looked at him. "I do not want you to do anything that puts you in trouble on my account." "I am not going to do anything illegal," he said. "I am going to have a conversation with Edward Rhodes." "Cyrus, a conversation," he said. "That is all." He found Edward Rhodes at the hotel bar that afternoon, nursing something amber in a glass and radiating the particular energy of a man who was tallying his regrets and coming up short on solutions. He looked up when Cyrus sat across from him, and his eyes were wary in the way of a man who had heard things. "You're Whitaker," Edward said. "I am," Cyrus said. "Anna told you I was here." "Word travels in small towns," Cyrus said. "Edward, I am going to be straightforward with you because I think it saves time. You have an opportunity here to do the one decent thing left available to you, which is to cooperate fully with the divorce proceedings, sign whatever needs signing, and leave Anna and Thomas in peace. Alternatively, you can attempt to be difficult, in which case your documented desertion becomes a matter of county court record with detailed accounting of your financial betrayal, and whatever small professional reputation you have managed to rebuild in Santa Fe becomes significantly smaller." He paused. "I am not threatening you. I am describing the situation accurately so you can make an informed choice." Edward looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You love her." "Yes," Cyrus said, "I do. You plan to marry her. That is between Anna and me. It is not connected to what you decide to do with the divorce." Edward was quiet for a moment, looking at his glass. Then he said something that Cyrus had not expected. "She is a remarkable woman, she always was. I did not deserve her." "No," Cyrus agreed without heat. "You did not." Edward left Redemption Creek the next morning. He sent a signed letter of cooperation to Anna's lawyer in Denver 2 weeks later, which the lawyer described as remarkably complete and accomplished in half the usual time. Thomas, who had not been told his father was in town, never knew Edward had come. Anna and Cyrus agreed on this together, late on the evening of Edward's departure, sitting on Anna's porch with the yellow flowers bright in the moonlight. Thomas was old enough to be hurt by the knowledge that his father had ridden in and ridden out again without asking to see him directly, and young enough that the hurt would have been categorical and raw, and neither of them was willing to put him through it unnecessarily. "There will come a time when he has questions," Anna said, "about his father, about what happened." "There will," Cyrus agreed. "I will answer them honestly. Children deserve honest answers about their parents even when the truth is hard." "They do," he said. "And if he asks me, I will tell him what I know, which is that his father was a man who had real gifts and real failures, and that the failure to stay was a failure of courage, and that it says nothing about Thomas's worth." Anna looked at him in the moonlight. "That is exactly the right thing to say." "I had time to think it through," he said. She put her hand over his on the armrest of the porch chair. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Cyrus," she said. "Anna," he said. "I love you," she said. "I should have said that back in April when you said it to me. I feel it and it is real, and I should have said it plainly." "You showed me," he said. "Every day since April you showed me." "I want you to know it in words," she said. "I love you. I have loved you since before I was willing to admit it, because the last time I trusted a man with that I came out of it considerably worse. But you are not him. You are not even close to him." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it. "I know you are still in the middle of the legal process," he said. "I am not going anywhere. But when the time is right, I would like to ask you something." "I suspect I know what you would like to ask me," she said, and there was a smile in her voice even in the dark. "Likely," he said, "and I suspect I know what the answer will be." "Likely," she agreed. They sat on the porch until the stars had fully taken over the sky, and it was one of those evenings that settles into a person's memory with the quality of something they will carry forever, ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The legal dissolution of Anna's marriage to Edward Rhodes was finalized in the early fall of 1882, 7 years and several seasons after Cyrus had walked away from a woman he loved and spent every day since regretting it. The paperwork arrived from Denver on a Wednesday, and Anna read it twice at the kitchen table with Thomas in school and Harriet at the store, and then she put it carefully in the wooden box where she kept important documents, and she closed the lid. She walked to the stable on the east edge of town where she knew Cyrus kept Cooper, and she found him there cleaning tack in the afternoon light, and she said, "The papers came." He set down the leather he was working with and turned to look at her. "It is final," she said. He crossed the stable to her in a few steps and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her, really kissed her for the first time, long and honest, and saying everything the conversation had been building toward for months. And she kissed him back with all the relief and love and hard-won certainty of a woman who had survived everything that had been thrown at her and had landed somehow here. When they stepped back from each other, both of them breathing unsteadily, Cyrus reached into the pocket of his coat. He had been carrying the ring since June. He'd had it made by the silversmith in Ridgecrest, which was the next town over and had a craftsman who did fine work, and he'd specified exactly what he wanted. A simple band with a turquoise setting, the kind of blue that reminded him of the Colorado sky on a clear winter day, and he'd been carrying it in his coat for 3 months waiting for the right moment. "I have a question," he said. Anna looked at the ring and then up at him with eyes that were bright with something she wasn't trying to hide. "Anna Rhodes," he said, "you are the most remarkable person I have ever known in my life. I was a fool at 27, and I spent years living with the consequences of that. I am asking you now, with every honest thing I have in me, if you will marry me, Not because you need someone to provide for you or protect you, because you are entirely capable of doing both of those things yourself, but because I love you and because I think we make each other better, and because I want to spend the rest of my life earning the place beside you." She took the ring from his hand and looked at it for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. For months now I have been waiting for you to." She laughed, and the laugh was everything, warm and clear and genuine. "Yes, Cyrus, yes." He put the ring on her finger and then held her hand and looked at her in the afternoon light coming through the stable door, and thought with absolute clarity that this was the best and most real thing that had ever happened to him. "We should tell Thomas," she said. "How do you think he'll take it?" Cyrus asked. She tilted her head, considering seriously. "He will pretend to be uncertain for approximately 45 seconds, because he has his father's instinct for drama, and then he will ask if he can call you something other than Mr. Whitaker, because he has been working up to asking that for weeks." Cyrus laughed. "What would I like him to call me? What would you like him to call you?" She countered. He thought about it. "Whatever he wants," he said. "Whatever is right for him. I am not trying to replace something. I am trying to add something. Those are different things." She squeezed his hand. "They are entirely different things, and you understand that, which is one of the things I love about you." They told Thomas that evening at dinner. Anna had made roast chicken because Thomas had declared it his favorite meal approximately 40 times in his short life, and the table was set properly with the good plates. And Thomas, being 12 years old and perceptive enough to register that something important was happening, but uncertain enough about its nature to be slightly anxious, arrived at the table and looked between them with the expression of a boy doing rapid calculations. "Thomas," Anna said, "Cyrus has asked me to marry him and I have said yes." The 45 seconds of performed uncertainty. Cyrus counted them almost exactly. Then Thomas said, "Does this mean Cooper lives in our stable?" "It likely means we have a different stable," Cyrus said. "A house with proper space." "A bigger house," Thomas said. "A bigger house," Cyrus confirmed. Thomas nodded slowly in the manner of a boy evaluating the practical terms of a significant development. "Can I call you something different than Mr. Whitaker?" Anna looked at Cyrus. Cyrus looked at Thomas. "Whatever is right for you," Cyrus said. "I will answer to whatever you choose." Thomas thought about it with the gravity of a 12-year-old making an important linguistic decision. "I could call you by your name," he said. "Just Cyrus. Is that all right?" "That is perfectly all right," Cyrus said. Thomas nodded, satisfied. Then, in the way that children sometimes strip the ceremony away entirely and get to the marrow of a thing, he said, "You are not going to leave, are you? You are going to stay?" The question landed on the table like a stone. Everyone at the table knew what it was really asking. "I am going to stay," Cyrus said. "Thomas, I give you my word, I am staying." Thomas looked at him for a long, serious moment. Then he picked up his fork and said, "The chicken is very good, Mama." And that was that. The wedding took place in October of 1882, in the small church in Redemption Creek that smelled of pine resin and old hymn books, with Harriet Boone standing as witness for Anna and Bart Langley, considerably scrubbed up and uncomfortable in his good coat, standing as witness for Cyrus. Thomas sat in the front pew with his best shirt on, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of a boy determined to remember everything about the day. Anna wore a dress the color of sage, because she had never been particularly interested in conventions that didn't serve her, and she had sewn it herself over the preceding weeks with help from Mrs. Potts next door, who had better hands for fine work. She had wildflowers in her hair, actual wildflowers from the edge of the range, yellows and blues, and a deep purple that Cyrus couldn't name. And she looked more beautiful than anyone Cyrus had ever seen in 34 years of paying attention to the world. When the minister asked Cyrus if he took this woman, Cyrus said yes with a certainty that was the opposite of ceremony. The kind of yes that comes from a decision already made so completely, it is almost a formality to say it out loud. When the minister asked Anna the same, she said yes, and she was looking at Cyrus when she said it, and the look was the entire love story in a single moment. The difficult history, the careful present, the hopeful future, all of it compressed into the direct, clear, certain gaze of a woman who had survived everything and chosen this deliberately. Afterward, there was a dinner at Harriet's house with more people than expected, because Redemption Creek was that kind of town, and an occasion like this was permission for everyone to cook something and bring it. The table was crowded with dishes and conversation, and Thomas somehow ended up in a long discussion with Bart Langley about the relative merits of different horse breeds that lasted until well past the boys' usual bedtime. Cyrus found Anna standing on Harriet's porch in the cool evening air, watching the stars appear. "Married," he said, standing beside her. "Married," she agreed. "How do you feel?" "Like I have been trying to get here for 7 years," he said. Like everything before this was the difficult part, and now the good part starts. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "There will still be difficult parts," she said. "Life does not stop being difficult because of a ceremony." "No," he agreed, "but now I am in the difficult parts with you instead of next to them. That is entirely different." She tilted her head up to look at him. "That is a good way of putting it. I have had years to prepare my best lines," he said. She laughed and he kissed her, and from inside the house Thomas's voice could be heard saying that Appaloosas were significantly superior to paints, and Bart Langley's voice could be heard arguing the contrary with great enthusiasm, and the stars were thick and bright above the Colorado Territory, and everything was exactly as it should be. The months that followed were the kind of months that build a life rather than simply pass through one. They moved into a house on the edge of town, bigger than Anna's rental, a proper house with 3 bedrooms and a good kitchen, and a stable that was sized correctly for a working man's horse plus room to spare. Cyrus had bought it outright with money saved from years of work and a willingness to live simply, and he and Thomas had spent a weekend patching the roof and repainting the trim in a negotiated shade of dark green that Thomas had argued for on aesthetic grounds and won. Anna kept working at the general store because she liked working at the general store, and because Harriet needed her, and because she was a woman who defined herself by what she built and contributed, not by what her husband provided. Cyrus continued his work for the Hollister Ranch through the winter and began looking in the spring for something that would keep him closer to home. He found it in an unlikely way. The Redemption Creek Town Council, which had finally grown tired of the informal and inconsistent way justice was administered in the county, had been searching for a sheriff who was qualified but not embedded in any existing factional politics. A council member named Vance, who had spoken to several people in the region about Cyrus's reputation, approached him in March of 1883 with the proposal. Cyrus sat with it for a week. He had never wanted the badge. He had always felt the badge was for men who needed the authority to feel comfortable, and he had never needed authority to do the right thing. But Redemption Creek was his town now, and the people in it were his people, including a wife and a boy, and there was something different about doing this work when it was for something particular instead of simply for hire. He accepted. Anna, when he told her, looked at him for a moment and then said, "I think you have been preparing for that job your whole career without knowing it." "That is either reassuring or a little frightening," he said. "Both," she said, smiling. "That is generally how the best things work." He was a good sheriff. The reputation he had built in 2 decades of hired work was that he was fair and frightening in roughly equal measure, frightening to people who intended harm, fair to everyone else, and both of those qualities served the badge. He had a way of resolving disputes before they required force that came from genuinely listening to both sides of a situation before acting, which was a rarer skill than most people realized in 1883 in the Colorado Territory. There were incidents, because there always were in a county that straddled trade routes and had a saloon with a reputation. There was a rustling situation in the summer of 1883 that required a week of careful tracking, and a confrontation in a narrow canyon that Cyrus handled without anyone being killed. which was the outcome he preferred. There was a land dispute between two ranchers that replicated, in small ways, the corruption he had encountered in Harlan's Bluff years earlier, and he addressed it with a thoroughness that left both parties certain that he was the wrong person to try to manipulate. There was a fire at the livery stable in the winter that required the kind of organized community response that let him see what Redemption Creek was made of. And what it was made of was people who showed up for each other when it mattered. Through all of it, Thomas grew. He was 13, 14, taller by the season, the careful, watchful boy opening slowly into something more confident and assured as the permanence of the life around him became evident. He had begun calling Cyrus Pa sometime in the winter of 1883, so gradually and naturally that neither he nor Cyrus could afterward identify exactly when it had started. There was no ceremony to it. There was no declaration. One day Thomas said it without thinking, and Cyrus heard it and felt it land somewhere deep and permanent, and that was that. Thomas was a reader like his mother, and a tinkerer like no one they could immediately identify in his family history, who took apart anything mechanical he could get his hands on and usually put it back together successfully. He had a gift for the emerging science of telegraphy that the new telegraph office in Redemption Creek had revealed when Thomas had begun spending his after-school hours at the counter pestering the telegraph operator, a patient man named Fisher, with questions about the machines. Fisher, recognizing genuine talent when he saw it, had taken Thomas on as a de facto apprentice, and by the time Thomas was 15, he could receive and transmit Morse code faster than Fisher himself. "He has a future in communications," Anna said on an autumn evening in 1884, reading one of Thomas's school essays about the importance of the transcontinental telegraph network, which was coherent and thoughtful, and showed a grasp of geography and technology that his school teacher, a new arrival named Miss Hamlin, had praised extravagantly in a note sent home. "He has a future in anything he decides," Cyrus said. "He has your capacity for learning and something else, something that's his own. He has your patience," Anna said. "That is rarer than people think." Cyrus looked at her across the kitchen table. "You think so?" "I know so," she said. "Patience is how he waited for the world to be safe again after Edward left. Patience is how he decided to trust you. He watched you for months before he decided you were real. That is not mine. That is something he learned watching you." The things that passed between them in moments like this, in ordinary kitchen evenings, were the substance of everything Cyrus had wanted when he'd been riding the territory alone, thinking about what he'd left behind. Not the dramatic declarations, though those had their place. The small, honest observations. The knowledge that you were seen by someone who had earned the right to see you. They learned in January of 1885 that Anna was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting across the breakfast table from him with a look on her face that he had not seen before, not nervous exactly, but very still, the way Anna got when something mattered so much she was monitoring herself carefully. "I have news," she said. "It appears we are going to have a child." Cyrus put down his coffee cup very carefully. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. "I have seen Dr. Mercer. He confirms it. He estimates July." He was around the table and kneeling beside her chair in a movement he didn't consciously decide to make, his hands around hers, looking up at her face. "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at him and the stillness broke into something warm and luminous. "I am so happy," she said. "Cyrus, I am so happy I cannot quite contain it. I am also very aware that I am 32, and this is a second pregnancy, and Dr. Mercer has advised me not to take it lightly, so I am managing the happiness responsibly." He laughed, and it came out with more feeling in it than he'd intended, something close to the kind of undignified relief that men didn't usually admit to. "You are managing the happiness responsibly," he repeated. "That is the most honest thing that has ever been said." She laughed too, and he put his forehead against her hands, and they stayed like that for a moment. Thomas was 15 when they told him. He received the news with the particular expression of a 15-year-old confronting the reality that his parents had a life that didn't entirely center on him, which was a complex expression involving several layers of feeling. Then he said with studied casualness, "So I am going to be a brother." "You are," Anna said. "A younger sibling is something I could manage," Thomas said, which was his way of saying he was pleased. The pregnancy was unremarkable in all the best ways. Anna continued working at the store through the spring, reducing her hours in June when the heat became a factor, and she endured Cyrus's attentiveness, which he acknowledged was at times excessive, with a patience that she extended to him as a gift because she recognized it came from a place of love rather than doubt in her competence. Their son was born on July 14, 1885, in the bedroom of the house in Redemption Creek, with Dr. Mercer attending and Harriet in the kitchen boiling water and Cyrus doing the most difficult thing he had ever done, which was waiting. Thomas sat on the porch through the whole of it, whittling with improved skill at a piece of cedar, and Cyrus sat beside him for part of it because the two of them needed company and the waiting was easier together. When Dr. Mercer came to the door and said, "A boy, Mrs. Whitaker is well and asking for you," Cyrus went in with a step that was not quite steady, and Thomas stayed on the porch and let out a long, shaking breath and looked out at the Colorado evening sky. The boy was named Samuel James Whitaker. Samuel for Anna's father, who had died when she was 18 and whom she had loved extravagantly. James for nobody in particular, just because it sounded right beside Samuel, which was a reason Anna declared entirely sufficient. Samuel was a different kind of child than Thomas had been. Where Thomas had been watchful and deliberate, Samuel was immediate and ardent, interested in everything at once, loud about his preferences, generous with his laughter and his fury both. He had Anna's dark hair and Cyrus's gray eyes and Thomas's ability to completely dominate any room he entered despite being, for several years, quite small. Thomas was, despite the 15-year-old's initial studied neutrality, completely undone by his baby brother within approximately 4 days of Samuel's arrival. He spent time on the floor with the infant with the concentration of a boy discovering something unexpectedly important about himself. And by the time Samuel was 2 months old, Thomas was the person Samuel most reliably smiled at, which Thomas tried not to be visibly delighted by and failed entirely. Cyrus watched his family take shape around him with the sustained, grateful astonishment of a man who had spent years in a diminished version of his own life and had not known quite how diminished it was until he could compare it to this. He was not a demonstrative man by the external measures most people applied to demonstrativeness. He did not make speeches at the dinner table or write poetry, though he thought about things in language that could have become poetry if he had been a different kind of man. But he loved his family with a completeness that was visible in every choice he made, in the way he organized his work to be home for dinner, in the way he listened to Thomas talk about telegraphy with genuine interest, in the way he sat with Samuel on the porch on summer evenings while the boy pointed at everything in the yard and demanded its name, in the way he reached for Anna's hand whenever they were standing near each other in any situation at all. Anna was 33 that summer, and in full possession of the life she had chosen and built. The general store flourished under her management. Harriet had handed her increasing responsibility over the years and declared formally in the summer of 1885 that she was reducing her own role to what she called advisory capacity, which meant she came in 4 days a week and told Anna what she was doing wrong and was almost always right. Anna had also, through a conversation with the new school board that had taken considerable diplomatic effort, resumed teaching 2 mornings a week for the younger children, an arrangement that satisfied everyone and kept the school board from having to replace Miss Hamlin, who had her hands full with the older students. The town of Redemption Creek continued to grow. By 1886 it had 2 hotels, 3 churches, A telegraph office, a doctor's surgery, a dentist who was less terrifying than most, and the beginnings of a proper newspaper. The railroad had been extended through a junction town 15 miles south, which brought commerce and people, and the particular mixed blessing of increased connection to the wider world. Cyrus managed the growth with the same steady pragmatism he applied to everything. New people meant new situations, new disputes, new personalities to read and respond to accurately. He was helped by a deputy he'd hired in 1884, a young man of 22 named Preston Webb who was diligent and quick to learn, and who had the additional virtue of being uniformly liked by everyone, which was a skill Cyrus had never quite mastered and was glad to have covered. In the summer of 1886, on an evening when the heat had finally broken, and the air coming down from the mountains smelled of rain and pine, Cyrus was sitting on the porch with Anna while Samuel, aged almost 1, slept in the crib visible through the open window. Thomas was at the telegraph office, as he was most evenings. The crickets had started up and the sky was going from orange to purple to the first deep blue of the arriving night. Anna said, "Do you ever think about Harlan's Bluff?" "Sometimes," he said, "not with regret anymore, more like looking at where you were to understand how you got to where you are." "I think about it sometimes," she said. "I think about the morning I arrived on that stage and you were standing there. I thought you were the most serious person I had ever seen and I immediately wanted to make you laugh." "You succeeded," he said. "Within about 30 seconds," she agreed, pleased with herself. "I thought you were the most certain person I had ever seen," he said. "Like you had already decided you were going to make it work, whatever it was. The town, the job, everything. Like the doubt everyone else was carrying, you had just put down at the state line before you crossed into Texas." "I had plenty of doubt," she said. "I was simply not going to let the doubt drive." "That is what I mean," he said. "That is the thing about you that I could see from 30 seconds in. You were always going to be in charge of yourself." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the evening sky. "I am glad you came to Redemption Creek," she said. "I know it was coincidence or something like coincidence, but I am glad. I think we needed to be who we became after Harlan's Bluff before we could do this right." He considered that. "I think you are right," he said. "I was not ready then. I knew how to love you, but I did not know how to stay. And now staying is the easiest thing I do," he said. "Everything else is the work. Staying is what makes the work possible." She leaned across the gap between their chairs and found his hand, and he held it. "Cyrus," she said, "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it before I tell you the news that goes with it." He looked at her. "All right. You are the best thing that has ever been deliberately chosen in my life," she said. "Thomas was given to me, and he is the greatest gift I have been given. Samuel was given to us, and he is everything. But you, I chose you, eyes open, knowing the full history, and I would choose you again in every version of this life." He felt that go all the way through him, deep and permanent, the way her love had always registered. "Anna," he said. "What is the news?" She smiled at him in the darkening evening, and the smile was entirely self-satisfied and warm and exactly Anna Rhodes Whitaker in the fullness of who she was. "We are having another child," she said. "Dr. Mercer says March." He brought her hand up and kissed it. "A girl this time, maybe," he said. "Or another boy," she said. "I will be equally happy." "So will I," he said. "I will be equally delighted with whatever we get." Thomas, when told the following day, was considerably less performed in his reaction than he had been the first time. He was 16 now, 3/4 grown, and he simply grinned and said, "Good. Samuel needs someone to pester." The baby born in March of 1887 was indeed a girl, and she was named Clara Elizabeth Whitaker, Clara not for Clara Fontaine, but for Anna's grandmother, whose name had always seemed to Anna like something worth carrying forward, and Elizabeth for the pure sound of it beside Clara. She was small and fierce, and from the very first hours of her life managed to communicate her preferences with an authority that made the attending Dr. Mercer say, entirely sincerely, that one knows exactly what she wants. Anna, exhausted and radiant in the way she always was after the enormous physical work of bringing a child into the world, had laughed at that and said, "She is a Whitaker." They all know exactly what they want. Thomas was 17 when Clara was born, and he demonstrated with Clara the same entirely undone quality he had demonstrated with Samuel. He had not known he was going to be this kind of brother, but he was this kind of brother, and it was one of the revelations about Thomas Rhodes Whitaker that continued to accumulate as the years passed, and the man he was becoming came into clearer focus. By 1888, Thomas was 18 and formally employed as a telegraph operator in Redemption Creek, having taken over the position from Fisher, who had retired. He was also, by that point, corresponding with a girl in Denver named Rachel Soren, whom he had met during a visit to the city with a school group 2 years earlier, and with whom he had been exchanging letters at a rate that would have been suspicious to less attentive parents, and was perfectly transparent to both Cyrus and Anna. "Is he going to do something about the Denver situation?" Cyrus asked Anna one evening, in the particular shorthand of parents discussing their children. "He will when he is ready," Anna said. "He is being thorough, he is thinking it through from every angle." "He is exactly like you," Cyrus said. "He is," Anna agreed, "which is why I know it will work out." He will get there. Thomas did get there. In the autumn of 1888, he made a formal journey to Denver to meet Rachel Soren and her family, returning 5 days later with a particular expression that both Cyrus and Anna recognized immediately. "Well," Cyrus said at the dinner table, while Samuel ate noisily and Clara banged a spoon against the table with methodical cheerfulness. "I am going to ask her to come here," Thomas said, "next spring, to visit properly. And then I am going to ask her something else." "Good," Cyrus said. "She is remarkable," Thomas said. And then, unexpectedly, he looked at Cyrus with those eyes that had been watching the world so carefully for so long. "How did you know? About Mama? How did you know it was the real thing and not just wanting someone to be the real thing?" Cyrus considered the question seriously, as Thomas's questions had always deserved. "Because being around her made me feel more like myself," he said. "Not a better performance of myself, more actually myself. And because the thought of her being unhappy was unbearable in a way that had nothing to do with what I wanted and everything to do with what I wanted for her. When those two things are true at the same time, that is usually real." Thomas looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that is what it is." The spring of 1889 brought Rachel Soren to Redemption Creek, a visit that lasted 3 weeks and concluded with Thomas asking, in the formal manner he had prepared for, and Rachel accepting. They were married that autumn in the same church where Cyrus and Anna had been married 7 years earlier. The church was fuller this time. Redemption Creek was a larger town in 1889, and Thomas Whitaker, he had taken Cyrus's name formally when he turned 18, a decision that he had made alone and announced to both of them at breakfast one morning, and which Cyrus had received with more feeling than he'd been able to fully conceal. Thomas Whitaker was a well-regarded member of the community, the man who kept the town connected to the rest of the country through the clicking wires. And the wedding was attended by most of Redemption Creek, and a surprising number of people who had come from Denver. Anna sat beside Cyrus in the front pew of the church with Samuel, aged 4, on Cyrus's other side and Clara on her lap, and they watched Thomas marry Rachel Soren with an attention that was full of everything pride and joy, and the particular bittersweet awareness that parenthood involves watching the people you love most walk deliberately into their own lives. When the minister pronounced Thomas and Rachel married and the church applauded, Cyrus found Anna's hand without looking, and she held it without looking, and between them passed the entire weight and grace of what they had built. Outside after the ceremony, Cyrus stood with Bart Langley, who had come from his ranch 40 miles south for the occasion and was considerably less uncomfortable in his good coat than he had been at Anna and Cyrus's wedding, having had more practice. "Look at that," Langley said, watching Thomas and Rachel accept congratulations from a crowd of well-wishers. "Yes," Cyrus said. You did all right, Whitaker. I had significant help, Cyrus said. Langley nodded toward Anna, who was in conversation with Harriet and Dr. Mercer's wife and laughing about something with her full, unguarded laugh. That woman there is something exceptional. She is, Cyrus said. She was always going to be. The question was always just whether I was going to be around to see it. And you are, Langley said. And I am, Cyrus said. The years that followed were the years of fullness, of a life lived deliberately and well in a place that had become genuinely home. Samuel grew into a boy of cheerful industry who decided at age 7 that he was going to be a doctor, prompted by a visit to Dr. Mercer's surgery that had struck him as the most interesting place he had ever been, and pursued this ambition with a consistency that impressed everyone who knew him. Clara was a force of determined intelligence, who had inherited her grandmother's habit of carrying seeds everywhere, and her mother's habit of watching everything carefully before committing to a position. Cyrus served as sheriff of Redemption Creek County for 11 years, retiring in 1893 at the age of 45, when the county had grown enough to require a full department rather than a sheriff and a deputy, and when he was honest with himself that the physical demands of the work were better suited to a younger man. He spent the first 6 months of retirement with the restlessness of a man who had been in motion for 20 years and didn't know how to be still, and then he and Anna made a decision that had been forming quietly between them for several years. They bought a piece of land 5 miles outside Redemption Creek, 30 acres of good ground with a creek running through it, and a view of the mountains that on clear days was simply beyond description. They built a house on it over the course of a year with help from Thomas and Rachel, and from the community that had watched them build their life. It was not a grand house, but it was exactly right big enough for their family when they gathered, comfortable enough for the two of them in the ordinary days, surrounded by land that Anna immediately and comprehensively planted with every variety of flower that would grow in Colorado. The window boxes were enormous. The garden was extravagant. The land around the house in spring was something that people drove out from town specifically to see. Samuel left Redemption Creek for medical school in 1902, at 17, older than most young men who attempted it but absolutely ready, with a letter of strong recommendation from Dr. Mercer and the savings he had accumulated working at the surgery for 3 years. He came home in the summers and wrote letters that were so full of information and enthusiasm that reading them was almost as good as having him there. Clara, at 15, was the child still at home, opinionated and dear and increasingly occupied with the question of what she intended to make of her life, which she discussed with Anna and Cyrus at the dinner table with the full seriousness of someone who considered these discussions important. She was interested in journalism. The Redemption Creek newspaper, now a proper weekly publication, had allowed her to write 3 pieces under her mother's encouragement and the editor's grudging recognition that she was better at it than most of his paid contributors. "You have a voice," the editor had told her. "You have your mother's directness and something else. Stay at it." "She is going to be remarkable," Anna said to Cyrus on the evening after that conversation. "She already is," Cyrus said. "You say that about all of them," Anna said. "Because it is true about all of them," he said. They were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, the mountains dark against the evening sky, the sound of the creek somewhere below them in the dark. Anna had a shawl around her shoulders against the October air. Cyrus had his arm around her. He was 50 years old in 1898. She was 45. The years had not been unkind. They had been real, which was different, which meant there were lines around their eyes and silver in both their heads, and a knowledge of each other that went so deep it was like a country they had lived in long enough to know every road and valley and difficult weather pattern. They were not young anymore in any of the ways youth shows itself externally. They were young in the ways that matter, which are internal, which are about still being genuinely interested in the days as they come. "I want to ask you something," Anna said. "Ask," he said. "Are you happy?" It was the kind of question that only someone confident in the answer asks. She was not asking out of uncertainty. She was asking because she wanted to hear it said. "Anna Rhodes Whitaker," he said, with all the steadiness and certainty that had taken him decades to fully develop. "I am the happiest I have been in my life, which is also the most I have ever been myself in my life, and I believe those two things are connected. You are what made both of them possible. You and the family we made and the life we built, and the fact that I had the great good fortune not to ride away from you twice." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. Then she said, "Twice. The first time I was a coward," he said. "The second time I was not. That is the whole difference." "The difference is also everything that came after," she said. "Thomas, Samuel, Clara, this house, this life. The whole difference is the whole life." "Yes," he said, "that is what I mean." She leaned into him and he held her, and the mountains were dark and the stars were coming out, and the creek ran its course in the dark below them, and the October air was cool and clean with the smell of the land they had made their own. Years later, when Samuel had come home from his medical practice in Denver for a summer visit with his wife, a nurse named Margaret, who was as precisely competent as Samuel himself, and whom the whole family loved immediately and permanently, and when Thomas and Rachel were coming for dinner with their 3 children on Sunday, and when Clara was home from the newspaper job she had taken in Colorado Springs and was sleeping in her old room and arguing with everyone at the breakfast table about the future of women's suffrage in a way that was exhausting and entirely right, Samuel sat down on the porch with Cyrus on a quiet morning before the household woke fully. He was 24. He had his mother's eyes and his father's way of being still when he had something important to say. "Pa," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Always," Cyrus said. "How did you and Mama find each other again?" Samuel asked. "The full story. I know the pieces, but not the whole thing." Cyrus sat back in the porch chair and looked at the mountains for a moment. The morning was cool and bright and the garden was full of colors. "The short version," he said, "is that I made a mistake when I was young and I spent years learning from it, and then the world brought me to where your mother was, and I was finally the right kind of man to not make the same mistake twice." Samuel considered this. "But what made you sure she was worth, what made me sure she was worth the risk of trying again, after everything?" Cyrus said. "After I'd already lost her once and she'd been through what she'd been through." "Yes," Samuel said. Cyrus thought about it. Thought about the general store in October of 1881, Anna looking up from behind the counter with those brown eyes that had never stopped being the most considering eyes he'd ever encountered. Thought about the porch conversations and the walks and the flower seeds she always seemed to be carrying somewhere. Thought about the 45-second pause that Thomas had given before asking about the horse. "Your mother," Cyrus said, "is the kind of woman a man does not ride away from twice. The first time I didn't fully understand what that meant. I rode away and I spent years understanding it. When I got back to her I understood it completely. And everything good in my life, you, Thomas, Clara, this house, these mountains, all of it is the consequence of that understanding." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you understood it." "So am I," Cyrus said. The morning opened fully around them, the sun coming over the eastern ridge and lighting up the Colorado land in broad gold, the garden catching the light, the mountains sharp and permanent in the clear air. From inside the house came the sound of Anna in the kitchen, and below that the sound of Clara's voice already holding forth on something, and below that the sound of the creek that had always run through this particular piece of ground, and would run through it long after any of them were here to notice. Cyrus Whitaker sat on his porch in the morning of a good day, in the fullness of a life built on the second chance he'd had the sense to take, and listened to his family inside the house, and was grateful in a way that was too deep and too comprehensive for words, which was all right, because he had never been the kind of man who needed words for everything. Some things were simply true, the way mountains were true, the way water running toward the sea was true. He loved his wife. He loved his children. He had stayed. He had stayed, and in the staying was everything. Sometime that afternoon, Thomas arrived with Rachel and the children in the wagon from town, and the porch filled up with people and noise, and the kind of glorious, exhausting, irreplaceable disorder that a family at full gathering creates. Samuel's Margaret organized things from the kitchen, with a competence that impressed even Anna. Clara held forth at the table about voting rights with a passion that made Thomas's oldest daughter, aged 7, look up from her biscuit with an expression of interested confusion. Thomas and Cyrus sat on the porch steps and talked about the state of the county. Thomas was on the town council now, which was fitting, and which Cyrus had never pushed him toward and was entirely proud of, while Samuel told Thomas's 2 younger children some story about a patient in Denver that had all 3 of them wide-eyed. In the kitchen, Anna and Rachel and Margaret were cooking and talking with the ease of women who had become, over years, genuinely fond of each other, and Anna's laughter moved through the house like something bright and permanent. Cyrus listened to it from the porch steps, and Thomas, sitting beside him, heard him exhale in a particular way. "What?" Thomas said. "Nothing," Cyrus said. "Just your mother's laugh." Thomas looked at him and then looked away at the mountain view, smiling. "You are still ridiculous about her," Thomas said. "I intend to continue being ridiculous about her," Cyrus said. "Good," Thomas said simply, and meant it entirely. The sun was moving west, and the gold of the afternoon was deepening toward the warm colors of evening, and the sounds of the family filled the farmhouse from cellar to roof, and the garden was full of Anna's insistent, determined, beautiful growing things, and the creek ran below in the cooling air, and the mountains stood in their ancient permanent blue against the sky, and Cyrus Whitaker sat among all of it as a man who had come, by a long road and a second chance, to exactly where he was supposed to be. He got up from the porch steps when he heard Anna call everyone to the table. He went inside to his family. He did not look back at the mountains or the garden or the porch. He didn't need to. He was not going anywhere.